Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to have Representative Himes with us today here on Justice Matters. As you all know, what we try to do every day is provide legal analysis of what's really going on inside our federal government, what's going on the rule of law front. To the extent we can figure it out, we try to translate it from legalese to English and give people information that is reliable and that they can use to try to figure out what's going on the legal landscape, what I sometimes refer to as the legal hellscape. So, Representative Himes, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
So, what I want to start with is the so-called fork in the road email. Some people have referred to that as a buyout, where the Trump administration sent an email to all 2 million plus federal workers, federal government employees, and essentially said, resign or else. Now, that's my characterization, but it really does feel like an ominous ultimatum that has been given to all federal workers, because they say, look, resign or we can't guarantee your job. You may be RIF'd, a reduction in force, so you may lose your job. We may ask you to move from one office to another. That's why I have been characterizing it as the resign or else email that went out to all federal government employees. What do you see as the impact of this kind of a move by a new administration coming in and essentially urging all federal government workers to resign from their jobs?
It's a good question. And I mean, the answer to your question of what's the impact is nothing good, right? And let me say right up front that if, Elon Musk in his infinite wisdom and the president had said, the American people want a streamlined, smaller, 21st century bureaucracy, and everything from the Department of Commerce to the EPA to the FBI. Let's really study this and, create a Formula One federal government. He would have had massive support, including from people like me, to say, yeah, we could use reform. But that's, of course, not what happened. What happened was, in many ways, the opposite, both in terms of legality, because it's not clear that this buyout program is legal, which, by the way, is a good reason for anybody considering taking that fork in the road to think twice. If the downside is that, down the road you lose your job, the last thing you want to do is lose your job, through some madcap Elon Musk effort, when you could have it could have happened with severance, et cetera, et cetera. But the real answer to your question, which I'm sort of alluding to when I say there's a smart way and a dumb way, and this isn't just a dumb way, this is an apocalyptic way. What did they just tell the 2 million plus workers of the federal government? You guys are an undifferentiated mass of worthless stuff, right? Now, maybe Elon Musk believes that, right? But America is finding out and is about to find out that, in fact, yeah, I'm not going to sit here and say the federal government is the most efficient thing on the planet, but you know what it is? It's comprised of people who go to work every single day to identify tornadoes that are about to hit Kansas, who are keeping our meat safe to eat and our water clean in cities like, Flint, Michigan. These are people who carry guns and take risks to go after terrorists and fentanyl producers. I could go on, right? But the point is that, America is about to learn that it's really easy to say that the federal government is an impediment and a bloated bureaucracy. But in many instances, these are the folks that are keeping you safe and keeping you alive. And it's really the way Trump and Musk have decided to do this. America is going to have to learn that the hard way. When tornadoes don't get predicted, or fentanyl gets through, or a terrorist attack happens, or the FAA comes apart, instead of doing this in a smart way. So think you just told a lot of good people who could make a lot more money in the private sector that you're an undifferentiated mass of incompetence, and no good can come from that. It may be satisfying, it may scratch some weird MAGA itch, but it's going to come at the cost of the safety of the American people.
Yeah, and let me pick up on your phrase, an undifferentiated mass of incompetence, because what they actually put in writing to all 2 million federal workers is the following, quote, "The way to greater American prosperity is encouraging people to move from lower productivity jobs in the public sector to higher productivity jobs in the private sector." I took real offense at that. I was a federal prosecutor for 30 years, having retired from the Department of Justice. We were not involved in low productivity public sector jobs. We were working 12, 14 hours a day. We were working weekends, and that is my experience. the overwhelming majority of the 2 million federal employees are public servants working their tails off on behalf of the American people in all of the ways you just stated. So, this is so insulting. It's so demeaning. And when you give people 9 days, they gave them 9 days to make the decision, resign or else. I'm not sure what would be more demoralizing to the federal workforce. Now, the good news is the so-called buyout period has closed. The last reporting I heard, I'd be interested if you heard something updating this number, is that only about 60,000 of the 2 million plus federal workers have hit resign. So they are not obeying in advance. That's not a criticism of the people who decided they don't want to be part of this, so they hit resign. But they're not obeying in advance. They're standing strong against this scheme. And, I think that speaks volumes about the quality of our federal government employees.
That's exactly right, Glenn. And let's step back to something you said there, because you hear it all the time. Government should be run more like a business. I represent a very business-oriented district. I was in business in the private sector for 12 years. I hear it all the time. That point that, it is in some sense a higher calling to be in business because it's more efficient, because it operates in a market environment. That's a weird libertarian view, which is completely at odds with what made this economy great. I mean, I sometimes chuckle because I've got hedge fund managers and private equity guys in Greenwich, Connecticut, who have this libertarian dream that if government consisted of 2 people, everybody would be better off. I say to them, and I would say this to Elon Musk, in your weird libertarian world where there are 3 people in the federal government, Mr. Musk, with your 170 IQ, you are 190 pounds of protein for a big hungry guy with a club. That's what a libertarian world looks like, right? And instead, the model, and this, look, I couldn't feel more strongly about this. Why are we great? We are great because government set the platform on which the private sector can do amazing things. So, Mr. Musk, how did you get here today? Oh, did you get here on 395 North, the highway that was built in the 1950s? By the way, you probably flew in. You know what? Your aircraft didn't crash because of the hard work of the people of the FAA. You didn't get mugged by a drug lord because of the hard work and the people in the FBI. People aren't, you get my point here, right? The right way to think about this is you want an efficient government creating the infrastructure for hopefully an equitable market capitalist system. And I do mean equitable, right? Because there are folks around here making sure that, folks don't get the equivalent of being mugged by crappy ass mortgages or terrible investment projects. The point is, you can't have a vibrant, innovative private sector unless you have the kind of protections and infrastructure that they are currently trying to dismantle.
So you mentioned the FBI. Let's zoom in from the fork in the road email to all 2 million federal workers to the FBI. They also received the fork in the road email, resign or else, but they are also being, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, victimized by the Trump administration in a number of other ways. First of all, some of the senior management and leadership has been forced out, and there are 2 lawsuits that have been filed by a series of FBI agents asserting their rights and saying that they have been wrongfully terminated or are about to be wrongfully terminated. I think those 2 suits have now been consolidated, and there may very well be more suits to come. But the other concern I have, having worked with the FBI for decades as a federal prosecutor, putting together criminal cases, including the largest RICO case ever brought in the courts of Washington, D.C., these are remarkable men and women, remarkable public servants, literally putting their lives on the line. And what they get for investigating the largest criminal case in our nation's history, the attack on the U.S. Capitol, is they say, hey, I want your names, the Trump administration. I want their names. No good can come of that. We can already see the retaliation against the men and women of the FBI who worked the January 6th cases, crimes that we all saw with our own eyes. I mean, to say that this is a morale busting move, to say it's a move that is a danger to our democracy is an understatement. But how do you read what the Trump administration is now trying to do to the FBI?
It's a great question, Glenn, and with very dangerous implications. And let's unpack what has become sort of one of the founding myths of MAGA, right? This is catechism. It is a mythological belief that no fact will contravene. Why is the FBI, in the words of MAGA and Donald Trump, a profoundly corrupt organization, right? Why? What is the factual basis for that? Well, a long time ago, the FBI, and this is all there on the public record, mishandled a surveillance request for an individual named Carter Page, who was sort of caught up in the investigation of whether there was collusion between the Russia-Trump. Now, so there's one guy, one affidavit in a FISA application. Shame on the FBI for doing it. They never should have done it. By the way, an inspector general said that it was not done with political intent. But anyway, the FBI is no more perfect than any organization out there. And yes, they weren't as compliant as they should have been with FISA 702. We don't need to get into that. But the point is, like any other organization, if you want to find a mistake or two that they made, you can. But that is a far cry from being a deeply corrupt organization. So anyway, the founding myth is insane. And it's insane because it starts with Jim Comey. By the way, Jim Comey, who you could argue handed the presidency to Donald Trump the first time around by reopening the, this is the organization. I promise you that if FBI agents in my district are voting for Congress, most of them are not voting for this Democrat. The FBI that has never been run by a Democrat, but always been run by, it's just, the point is, it is just myth, but it's dangerous myth, right? And we know why it's happening, right? It's because when the former president was found to have highly classified documents in his garage, by the way, as the current president was found to have them as well, they, holy moly, did an investigation of the mishandling of classified information. And they had the temerity, and here's where I get a little emotional, they had the temerity to prosecute people who assaulted 140 police officers here in the Capitol, who broke windows, who spread human feces around the inside heart of our democracy. The FBI had the temerity to go after those people who were acting in the interest of Donald Trump. That's why we are where we are. And so what happens? Yes. Here's Glenn, here's what really worries me. Kash Patel worries the hell out of me because he is a partisan warrior. We've never seen that at the FBI before. But here's what really worries me. It's back to the message you're sending. These are really important people to stopping terrorist attacks, to stopping the flow of fentanyl, to stopping extortion rings and the mafia and you name it. And now they're all saying to themselves, is it worth it for me to stick around at my $125,000 a year salary when I could go be a contractor or go be a lawyer for 3 times that? Do I want to be, unfairly condemned, attacked, fired, called whatever it is that Kash Patel calls me for 1/3 of my market value? And you can't get rid of talent. Ask any business leader, any CEO, their number one issue is recruiting and keeping talent. And Donald Trump is in the process of taking the talent inside the FBI and saying, get out of here. Americans are going to pay with their lives.
Yeah, and the whole concept of the weaponization of government. I testified at the request of Representative Plaskett to the Weaponization of Government Subcommittee, which is a lot of nonsense, quite frankly. But what we try to translate that phrase when you hear the Republicans saying weaponization of government, what they're really saying is if our guy commits crime, we don't want you investigating it. It is not the weaponization of government. I don't care if you carry an R or a D or an I after your name. If you commit crime, if you violate, your oath of office or, your sworn trust to the public, you need to be held accountable. And, so this whole weaponization is just a distracting term that unfortunately a lot of people have fallen for.
Yeah, and Glenn, it's worse than that. You're absolutely right, but it's worse than that, right? So here's the other element of weaponization, right? When Donald Trump goes on national television and says, maybe sunlight or drinking bleach will help cure COVID, which, by the way, at the time is killing thousands of Americans every day. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has the temerity to say, no, please don't drink bleach. The MAGA idiots are just like, oh, you're censoring free speech, right? So, look, MAGA is rooted, just as it is rooted with the fantasy in the FBI in fantasy, it's rooted in the denial of that climate change thing. So when EPA says, gosh, there's some pretty scary stuff happening out there with climate change, that's the weaponization of government, right? So, MAGA is rooted in a bunch of lies, right? that the FBI is weaponized against Donald Trump, even though they arguably helped elect Donald Trump the first time, that climate change doesn't exist, that the Constitution doesn't matter. I could go on about this stuff. The programs to try to diversify a, lily white workforce inside the CIA or some, bizarre illiberal attempt to impose affirmative action, they're rooted in lies. And so when somebody stands up and says, wait, that's not true, oh, well, now you've just attacked my right to freedom of expression.
Yeah, and we're probably part of the deep state, which brings us to Kash Patel. So I have a searing concern about Donald Trump's nominee to be the director of the FBI, Kash Patel. And I want to just tick off three reasons and ask you about them. One, we've all seen his enemies list, his deep state list. The Washington Post has accurately characterized it as an enemies list, the people that he wants to use the power of the FBI to retaliate against, really for transgressions against Donald Trump and against himself, Kash Patel. But then there are some things that I think are lesser discussed, but that are really important to career federal prosecutors. One is that a Colorado judge found that Kash Patel was, quote, not a credible witness. Let me tell everybody what that means. We keep what's called the Lewis list at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. And if an FBI agent or a police officer or an investigator is ever found to be not credible by a judge, that name goes on the Lewis list and that person becomes unsponsorable. What does that mean? We can't put them on the witness stand because we would have to disclose that a judge found they were not credible. They would be cross-examined and the jury wouldn't believe a word they said. That's why we took our responsibilities very seriously as prosecutors. If there was damaging information about witnesses, police officers, FBI agents, or otherwise, we had to disclose it to the defense. But there were some transgressions that were so serious that the witness became unusable. Kash Patel is expected to head up the FBI and the special agents of the FBI who will be in court testifying every day, and yet he would be unable to testify in court because no prosecutor could rely on his testimony and offer it to a jury. That is the legal upside down, and it's the ethical upside down, quite frankly. The other thing is Kash Patel, when he was subpoenaed to a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C., to testify about the suspected crimes of Donald Trump and others in connection with all things January 6th, he took the fifth. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and the law only permits somebody to do that if their truthful testimony would tend to incriminate them. If he believed he committed a crime and he didn't want to incriminate himself, he has that right that we all embrace, the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But what does that say about somebody's suitability to head up the FBI? He's not a credible witness. He's got an enemies list, and he had to plead the fifth because he didn't want to testify about his own potential crimes. This is the person who's going to head up our nation's preeminent law enforcement agency.
Yeah, well, you said it well. Glenn, I've sort of moved on because I've observed something, which is that on January 20th, the United States Senate left the building. There is no United States Senate anymore, and as a consequence, they will slavishly and sycophantly confirm Kash Patel and Robert Kennedy. They did Tulsi Gabbard. And to be fair to the administration, there have been some appointments that I've actually supported. But nonetheless, the Senate has left the building. By the way, the Congress has left the building. We don't have three branches of government anymore. We have two, maybe one, depending on whether the president decides to abide by the orders of the 70 courts who are now telling him that everything he's done so far has been illegal. But so I've moved on from Kash Patel. He's getting confirmed. And this is an area in which I've got something to say because as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, maybe Kash gets lucky. Maybe Kash, with all of his, hardcore partisan attacks, which I imagine he's going to, his testimony in front of this non-existent Senate notwithstanding, maybe he gets lucky. Maybe he gets to go a number of years without a terrorist attack in St. Louis or Portland or Newark, New Jersey. Maybe he gets lucky. I don't think so, because I see the threats and I promise you that when there is that attack in St. Louis or Newark or Portland, I'm going to be there to tell the story about how the destruction of the senior ranks of the FBI, the fear imposed on agents all over this country compromise their ability to stop that terrorist attack. Now, maybe Kash doesn't care about that, but that's what I'm focused on right now. And I'm sorry, it comes back to America, unfortunately, needing to learn how critical the federal government is to their safety and their health and their prosperity. When the FBI continues the erosion of its competence, which, by the way, started on the moment the Republican Congress got sworn in early January, there are going to be Hollywood-esque, grotesque consequences. And I'm pinning that son of a bitch on Kash Patel when it happens.
And one more substantive question before I ask you about action items, what we the people can do in this fight for a healthy democracy. But you brought up if the administration complies with court orders. I mean, that frankly may be the whole ball game for our democracy, because we are either in or very close to a true constitutional crisis, which I've always considered, the most accurate definition to be when you have those two co-equal branches of government butting heads, and basically one is refusing to acknowledge the lawful authority of the other. So Donald Trump is already flirting with a constitutional crisis. He may be going steady with it, maybe proposing to it soon. I don't know. But the reality is he's ignoring court orders. And the judge who just found that he was violating court orders to unfreeze federal funds opened with, in his very brief ruling, let's talk about criminal contempt. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion, Representative Himes, because if the court starts holding administration officials in criminal contempt, which can include confinement, then the question becomes, do those court orders get enforced? I mean, this is the death of hyperbole. These are unfortunately realistic discussions we have to have. Here is where I come down, and I'd love to hear where you come down on this. I also worked with the United States Marshal Service for decades. When we say they always get their man or their woman, they really do. That is a crack outfit. And they are the ones who, by law, are required to, they shall enforce federal court orders. There's no wiggle room there. I believe they take that legal obligation deadly seriously. I have lots of friends who are former and retired U.S. Marshals. They're going to follow the law. So now you have an executive branch agency, the U.S. Marshal Service, who are legally obligated to potentially enforce, even by way of taking into custody, Trump administration officials if they continue to knowingly and intelligently violate the federal court orders. How do you see this playing out? I know this is a thought experiment more than anything else.
Yeah, and it gets my dander up a little bit, because there are a number of good arguments about, to say the least, about why the president should do what pretty much every president has done, and abide by court orders, right? And the reason it gets my dander up is that, the same crew around here in the Capitol who had champagne parties when the Supreme Court invalidated President Biden's broad student loan program, said it was unconstitutional. The champagne came out, the dancing girls, the bonfires were lit. Now, all of a sudden, they're shocked to discover that the judiciary can get in the way of the president. Now, we've long blown through the argument that maybe you ought to be true to the oath you took to the Constitution. We've long blown through the argument that I make to some of my Republican friends. There will be a Democratic president someday, right? And when there is a Democratic president someday, you may want them to abide by the law. We've blown through that. So we are in this moment, and we perhaps have been a little sloppy in how we talk about a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis is not something that you don't like happening. A constitutional crisis is when the president, who has the guns, tells the courts, who don't have the guns by and large, that he's not going to pay attention to them. That is truly a constitutional crisis. Now, so what happens? Who knew that we would be sort of researching this? Thank God for people like Jamie Raskin and others who really can think forward on this stuff. And this is worthy of consideration for any of the political appointees or federal bureaucrats who are thinking of executing the president's decision not to abide by the law, thank you to the Supreme Court, apparently the president is unprosecutable and is an absolute ruler, but the bureaucrats inside the administration and the political appointees do not have the absolute immunity that was bestowed on the president. So, number one, there can be future criminal prosecutions for contempt of court, amongst other things. Now, I say future because, as you know, Glenn, a court could easily, if it was ignored, charge the people ignoring it. And by the way, the people aiding and abetting, right? There's a clear precedent for going after people who are aiding and abetting the ignoring of a court order. And people should think hard about that. Now, they may say, well, we own the Department of Justice. Pam Bondi's not coming after me. So, okay, set aside the criminal possibilities, which I think would be unwise to do. But nonetheless, there is also a court can enforce civil judgments of contempt, right? And that means potentially garnishing your wages, going after your assets, tying your ass up in court for a very, very long time. So I'm not going to tell you that I'm comfortable with that as redress, but it may be a lot of fun for the guy with absolute immunity and endowed by the Supreme Court. It may be fun for him to contemplate this. But people inside his administration need to remember those three words: aid and abet. It will not go well for you. And by the way, that's the legal answer. I don't know. There will be pushback, right? I mean, I hear my constituents saying, when the regime is illegal, do we go into a world of, popular protests, of general strikes, et cetera, et cetera? We could talk a long time about this. I hope it is a door that the president doesn't open. Now, he did say in his news conference, that remarkable news conference with Elon Musk's son and Elon Musk, 3 times he said, I don't ever ignore the courts, I appeal the courts. He also said he was going to build a Four Seasons in Gaza, so I'm never quite sure what to believe. But, again, there are mechanisms for redress that will not harm the president, but will harm anybody who helps the president ignore a court order.
Yeah, I love that because, as a former career prosecutor, if we had aider and abetter liability, or we had accessory liability, or we had co-conspirator liability, if they all had agreed to sort of engage in this illegal conduct together, those are powerful tools. Pressure bursts pipes. And we were always trying to honestly and ethically and in accordance with the law and the Constitution, burst pipes by, for example, bringing cooperating witnesses on board who might have been part of the illegality, but who were now prepared to do the right thing. So, Representative Hymes, the question I probably get most frequently from our viewers is, what can I do? What can we do? What can the American people do to engage in this fight for a healthy and viable democracy? And what advice do you give to people?
Yeah, let me give you 3 quick things. There's a lot, and there's lots of opinion. Let me give you 3. Number one, pressure must be put on Republican legislators. These are not uniformly evil people. It's terrible to think in those terms. Pressure must be put on whatever realm, on foreign aid, but certainly on abiding by the traditional norms of the Constitution and the Constitution itself. Number one. Number 2, I think your audience and you are uniquely in a position to tell the story about what the DOJ and the FBI are actually all about. Right? Because again, it's catechism for MAGA that the FBI is a mafia operation. And a bunch of alums who tell stories about agents who were lost in service, going after drug kingpins and everything. We need to change popular sentiment about that. We need to make sure that America understands that the FBI is one of the foremost agencies keeping them safe, keeping them alive. And I think your audience is probably uniquely situated to do that. And then, we need to build those networks. I mean, if things get really ugly, if we go the route of Central America in 1965, right, organized networks to push back on illegal behavior are going to be critical. And that, everything from the indivisible groups out there to former lawyers to the ABA, there's a reason why totalitarians go after third-party independent associations, because they're really effective at pushing back against authoritarians.
Yeah, great advice. The last thing we can do is be despondent and bury our heads in the sand, because that's exactly what the nefarious forces, and that doesn't mean the whole Republican Party, but certainly Trump and some of his lapdogs, that's what they want us to do, because that will make their dirty takeover of government all the easier. So we ain't doing that. So I appreciate the advice to our viewers, and I appreciate everything you're doing on behalf of the rule of law, on behalf of the good men and women of the federal government, and on behalf of our democracy. We appreciate it. We applaud it. And I really am grateful that you took some time out of your very busy schedule to join us here on Justice Matters.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. Anytime. Keep up the great work.